a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knows each other and nothing seems out of the ordinary. The morning begins as usual with a call to the police, concerned neighbors, and puzzled family members. The house appears perfectly normal, no signs of a struggle, everything seemingly in its place. But one detail disrupts this familiar picture: a woman seated too calmly in an armchair by the fireplace. Everything points to a swift, carefully planned act, but something in this story doesn't quite add up. The neighbors insist that no one had entered during the night, and her husband says he was out on a morning run, leaving the house as usual. So why is there a photograph on the table, showing the two of them together with the caption, "Forever?" Let's begin another dark story, a tale where every fact is concealed behind layers of well-crafted deceit. It was an August morning in 2010, around 5 a.m. As usual, Sadish was the first to wake. The house was still in silence, and he moved carefully so as not to disturb it. The residents of Holy Mount, a neighborhood in southern Bangalore, knew him as a modest, almost invisible presence. But little did they know the thoughts that occupied his mind during his early morning runs. This hour was his time to think about his career, his plans, his future with Priyanka. As he left the house at 5:40, he took one last look at the windows, where his wife was probably just beginning her morning yoga. Priyanka also valued these early hours, spending them alone, moving through her familiar yoga routine, which gave her strength and balance before a long workday. She taught mathematics at a prestigious school on Kanakapura Road, known for its high standards and demanding curriculum. Her colleagues and students saw her as a strict but caring teacher, and parents often expressed gratitude for the genuine attention she gave to their children. Sadish and Priyanka had moved to Holy Mount a couple of years ago, renting a home on a quiet street where family bonds were strong and houses stood shielded from prying eyes. This was a neighborhood where neighbors had known each other for decades and rarely intruded into each other's personal lives, which suited Sadish Gupta very well. Their life was calm and steady, and they blended in seamlessly with the other families around them. Although they rented, their house became a sanctuary, and Priyanka infused it with warmth and a cozy atmosphere, which even occasional guests felt when they came by for tea. But there were aspects of their life known only to them. They didn't have children, a topic that occasionally came up with others, but they didn't make an issue of it. Within their marriage, Sadish and Priyanka found harmony. They were comfortable together, and it suited them to shape their future as they envisioned it. They had decided to channel their efforts into acquiring a home of their own, a real place of strength, where they could invest not only money but also their hearts. About 2 months ago, this idea finally began to take shape. They chose a plot on the outskirts of the city, among hills and fields, where they would build their home. The anticipation of this project had become a new source of inspiration for them. Sadish's morning route wound through quiet streets just beginning to stir, the city's early rhythm matching the flow of his thoughts. It was 6:40 a.m. when Sadish returned from his run. His steps had slowed, and his heartbeat was steadying. But then his phone vibrated, showing Priyanka's name on the screen. She rarely called him at this hour, so he immediately felt a sense of unease. Her voice was tense and anxious. She explained that 2 strangers had appeared near the house, introducing themselves as paper collectors and asking if they had any old newspapers or scrap paper. It was a common enough request, but there was one strange thing. They looked at her in an unsettling way. In their neighborhood, it was rare to see anyone that early, especially collectors. Plus, the stores were still closed and the streets were empty. Sadish's pulse quickened. He immediately told Priyanka not to go near the door and promised he'd be back as soon as possible. Nearly running toward the house, he couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. The whole situation felt strange and illogical, and the closer he got to home, the stronger a cold fear took hold. As he reached the porch, he saw that the street was empty. The so-called collectors were gone. The porch was silent and still. He rang the doorbell, expecting Priyanka to answer right away, but there was no response. The silence felt too loud, too charged. He tried calling her again, but her phone was silent. His unease turned into genuine fear. Sadish realized he didn't have a spare key, and Priyanka likely had her key on her. That meant he couldn't get inside, and with each passing second, his anxiety grew stronger. Almost feverish with worry, he decided to rush back to the office, where they kept an extra key. All he could do was hope that Priyanka was okay. When he finally returned and opened the door, his hands were trembling. He stepped inside, immediately sensing something was wrong. The air in the house was thick and tense, as if it concealed a terrible secret. As he entered the living room, Satish froze. Priyanka was there, tied to a chair, her arms bound to the armrests. A deep wound crossed her neck, and blood was slowly pooling on the floor. A chill ran through his body, as if everything inside him had turned cold. On autopilot, he reached for his phone, dialing for emergency services. The words he spoke sounded hollow, as if they didn't come from his own voice. He called the police, barely aware of what he was saying, as if in a trance. Officers from the Holy Mount precinct arrived almost immediately, but they didn't need a briefing on what awaited them inside. Each of them froze at the sight of the tragic scene unfolding in the living room. People accustomed to confronting brutal acts were struck by the sight of Priyanka, tied to the chair, amid the remnants of a once cozy home, now shattered by this horrific event. The lead investigator gave a composed order that no one was to touch the body or any furniture until the forensic team arrived, though even he couldn't immediately pull his gaze away from the tragic scene. The room held no trace of the people who had done this, no obvious clue left behind. All that remained was pain, bitterness, and an overwhelming silence. Satish stood in shock, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before him. When his parents arrived, they rushed to his side, but he remained trapped in his own horror, as if numb to everything around him. Words failed everyone. Priyanka's parents didn't hear the terrible news until the next morning. In a house that, just a day before, had been filled with plans and hopes, now only a crushing silence lingered. All that remained of Satish's former life was memories. His sobs, punctuated by deep breaths, echoed through the empty house, leaving no space for sound, no room for peace. The officers, though accustomed to horrific scenes, tried to stay at a respectful distance, avoiding his gaze. The pain was too raw. One officer attempted to approach, offering him a glass of water, but Satish didn't respond. He seemed locked within his own thoughts, his stare fixed on the spot where life had once held its warmth. Meanwhile, the police began a thorough examination of the house, leaving no corner unchecked. Those two mysterious paper collectors Priyanka had mentioned became a particular point of interest, and officers immediately started questioning neighbors and others in the area. But to their surprise, no one had seen or heard of these individuals. The statements created a puzzle. Where had these strangers gone? Satish was adamant that they were the reason he felt alarmed enough to come back early from his run. Despite his certainty, a hint of doubt crept into the officers' minds. As they investigated further, another odd detail emerged. Cash and jewelry were missing. With difficulty, Satish explained that he had been setting aside money to buy his wife a car as a surprise anniversary gift. It was his little secret, a plan he had carefully saved for, intending to create a joyful surprise. But now, his savings were gone, along with Priyanka's jewelry, which had meant so much to her. The amount stolen made police wonder if this crime could have been a robbery. However, the absence of any sign of forced entry presented a mystery. It looked as if whoever committed this act knew exactly what they were looking for and had planned every detail. The following morning, Priyanka's family received her remains, and Satish took on the difficult task of arranging the ceremony for her cremation. The service was held in silence, broken only by the heavy sighs and quiet sobs of those in attendance. Friends and relatives, devastated by what had happened, came to pay their respects, struggling to believe the reality before them. Priyanka's parents stood by Satish, their faces reflecting an inexpressible grief and unanswered questions. Their daughter's life had ended so abruptly, so tragically, that they found it hard to grasp the truth of it all. While officers combed through the house, the story was quickly gaining public attention. Before the funeral was even over, reporters had gathered outside, eager for any information about what had happened. News of the tragedy spread across Bangalore, shocking a city that, though no stranger to crime, was deeply disturbed by this incident. The community demanded answers. People wanted to know who could have committed such an act, and what could have driven this level of cruelty. Calls for justice echoed from all sides, and accusations of police inaction began to circulate. Satish felt time slipping away, with the investigation seeming to stagnate. He couldn't accept this sense of injustice. One day, he walked to the police station and, without going inside, sat down right outside the entrance. His resolve was clear. He would stay there until the police found the person responsible for his wife's death. With each passing day, his protest drew more attention. At first, passers-by stopped out of curiosity, but soon his silent demonstration became a talking point in the papers and on the news. Journalists began interviewing locals, many expressing sympathy, while criticism of the police grew. Why was the search taking so long when fresh clues should have been available? Why wasn't there more progress? Each day, Sadish returned to those stone steps, sitting in quiet mourning as people passed by, moved by his grief. Some paused to offer condolences, others brought him water, and occasionally he received notes of encouragement. The police, unsure of how to respond, tried to convince him to go home, assuring him they were doing everything possible, but Sadish held firm. Meanwhile, the officers were not idle. They dug deep into every aspect of Sadish and Priyanka's life, interviewing friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Every account they heard was the same. There were no signs of tension, no arguments between the couple. They had led a peaceful, happy life, and no one had a single doubt about their harmonious relationship. The investigators couldn't find evidence of enemies or grudges, leaving them with only more questions. All signs pointed to Sadish and Priyanka as a typical, contented couple. What then was the motive? Everything suggested a robbery, but why had it turned so violent? As time wore on, public dissatisfaction with the investigation mounted. Sadish's protest outside the station was only fueling the growing frustration, prompting people to question police action. Before long, Sadish had become something of a local hero. His story had spread throughout the city, and now everyone waited to see when the police would provide answers. On the evening of August 13th, several officers, watching his quiet vigil outside, decided to invite him into the station. Sadish couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope, wondering if there had finally been a breakthrough. But things would turn out differently. As soon as Sadish entered the office, police officers surrounded him, scrutinizing his statements for any inconsistencies. The questions became increasingly precise, and Sadish realized they were focused on the details of that fateful morning. They asked him when he left for his run, what time he received Priyanka's call, and exactly when he returned home. Sadish tried to respond confidently, but with each answer, he felt the tension around him growing. The officers mentioned that Priyanka's call was logged at 5:55 a.m., and according to his statements, he returned around 6:40. Yet they pointed out that the distance didn't quite match the time he claimed it took him to return. The officers were starting to pick up on small discrepancies in Sadish's account, which only raised their suspicions further. They pressed harder, asking for specifics about his actions that morning, his exact return time, and why he hadn't answered Priyanka's call immediately. Finally, they brought up the spare key he had reportedly gone back to the office to retrieve. Sadish explained that he had entered the building briefly, grabbed the key from a drawer, and left without delay. However, the officers revealed that surveillance footage showed he hadn't passed through the turnstile at all. He had only lingered at the entrance before leaving. With each new detail, Sadish's nerves became more evident. Detecting this, the officers intensified their questioning, not allowing him room to avoid any answers. The question of how he could have retrieved the key without entering the office remained unresolved. Sadish insisted he had gone inside, but the camera footage suggested otherwise. According to Sadish, when he returned home, he unlocked the door and immediately found his wife's body. The sight had shocked him, but he claimed he had called the emergency services right away to report the tragedy. Sadish maintained that, when he entered, he was alone with Priyanka. Neighbors confirmed that they hadn't noticed anything unusual that day. Residents on the floors above and below even remarked that if anyone had been asking for old newspapers, they would have known, as collectors in their area always visited each apartment in turn. But that hadn't happened, and this only added more confusion to the investigation. Determined to unravel the truth, police began analyzing Sadish's statements closely, trying to piece together what had occurred in the Gupta household. Sadish insisted he had hurried home after hearing about the suspicious visitors from Priyanka. But as detectives dissected his version of events, they uncovered numerous inconsistencies. The more he recounted his story, the more tangled the details became. Sitting across from the investigators, Sadish's face grew increasingly pale as they circled back to his statements, studying his every reaction. The officers watched him carefully, noting how his gaze shifted and how his hands trembled ever so slightly. Every gesture, every pause, every change in tone became a potential clue. During the interrogation, investigators reviewed Sadish and Priyanka's phone data, which raised further suspicions. Records showed that their phones were within the same cell tower range at the time of her death, indicating that Sadish was nearby, even though he claimed to be out on his morning run. The entire story grew increasingly contradictory, and Sadish became visibly uneasy with each new question. His tale of the paper collectors seemed less and less convincing, and detectives began to suspect there might be an entirely different motive behind this crime. When officers examined the items found around the house, their suspicions deepened. A pair of dirty gloves, a set of boots, and a sleeveless jacket with stains were hidden in a dark corner under the stairs, as if deliberately placed out of sight. A pack of cigarettes also caught their attention. Neither Sadish nor Priyanka smoked, but there it was on the floor, as if someone had either carelessly left it behind or intended to mislead the investigation. Forensic experts began to wonder who could have left these peculiar clues. The autopsy report added new and disturbing details. Priyanka had not only suffered a wound to the neck, but was also strangled beforehand, followed by several non-lethal cuts to her abdomen. These injuries pointed to a calculated level of cruelty. Furthermore, there were no signs of struggle on her body, suggesting that she hadn't resisted the assault. Had this been a typical robbery, Priyanka would likely have tried to defend herself, and signs of a struggle would have been evident. Yet forensic analysis found none. When Sadish informed the police that cash and jewelry were missing from the house, they decided to conduct a thorough search of every nook and cranny. Surprisingly, despite his claims, a significant amount of cash, around 100,000 rupees, was discovered hidden in a discreet spot within the house. This raised new questions. How could Sadish have overlooked such a large amount? If this had truly been a robbery, the perpetrator would likely have taken everything of value. Further investigation revealed that Priyanka's earrings, a ring, and a necklace also hadn't been taken, which cast serious doubt on the robbery theory. During yet another interrogation, the detectives confronted Sadish with direct questions, showing him photos of Priyanka's jewelry. These items were valuable, and if a thief had indeed broken into the house, they would have taken them. Sadish hesitated, fumbling with his answers as the questions became increasingly pointed. His responses grew inconsistent, and the foundation of his story seemed shakier than ever. The investigators began to suspect that a more complex motive lay behind the crime, something deeper than a simple burglary. They began wondering if hidden tensions in Sadish and Priyanka's relationship might have led to this tragedy. As the questioning intensified, Sadish grew visibly more anxious. His responses became muddled, his sentences more disjointed. Initially, he denied any involvement in the crime, but as the pressure mounted, he finally broke down. At first, his voice was soft, uncertain, but then, as if something within him gave way, he confessed. Sadish and Priyanka's story appeared to have started as a classic arranged marriage. In 2007, their families agreed to the union, and although both Sadish and Priyanka initially consented, differences began to emerge over time. Sadish, a native of Bangalore, had strong family ties and was raised with a deep sense of tradition and respect for his parents. His loyalty to his family was unwavering, and frequent visits to his parents felt natural to him. Priyanka, however, came from Uttar Pradesh, where she was used to greater independence and believed Sadish's primary duty was to her and their household, not to his parents. She expected his undivided attention, even suggesting at one point that he replace his family pendant with a locket bearing her photo, symbolizing that she should now be the focus of his life. Sadish tried to find a compromise, but a couple of years into the marriage, the tensions grew worse. Priyanka persistently urged him to move into a separate home, further from his family. Although it was difficult for him, Sadish eventually agreed, hoping that the move would ease the strain on their relationship. They rented an apartment in the Holy Mount neighborhood, and for a while, things between them seemed to improve. But soon, Priyanka began pressuring him again, this time demanding that he reduce contact with his family, especially when his father's business encountered difficulties, and they needed some financial support. Sadish wanted to help his parents, but Priyanka adamantly opposed it, forbidding him even from calling them. Resentment and anger built within Satish with each of Priyanka's remarks, especially considering that she maintained close daily contact with her own parents. For him, this was unbearable. His bitterness deepened, and he could feel his disappointment turning into hatred, though he tried to keep his feelings hidden. By April 2010, it seemed life was taking a turn for the better. They had just purchased a plot of land where they planned to build their own home. Family and friends gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony to show their support. But when Satish's parents arrived, Priyanka suddenly forbade them from entering, declaring that this land was exclusively for her and Satish, and that his parents had no place there. Satish was occupied with the ritual at the time, learning of the incident later from friends. He was shocked, and in that moment, he felt that he could never forgive her for the humiliation. From that point, a plan began forming in Satish's mind, one he kept hidden. Outwardly, he tried to appear as a caring and devoted husband, giving Priyanka ample attention to convince her that he had forgiven her behavior. To others, it looked as though their marriage was enjoying a new phase of happiness and unity, with the land purchase drawing them closer than ever. Yet deep within, entirely different emotions were brewing. He was developing his plan, masking it behind polite smiles and gestures of affection. Soon after, Priyanka began to experience health issues, prompting her mother to take her to Kerala for treatment involving Ayurvedic therapy. She stayed there for about 6 weeks, during which Satish frequently called her, kept up affectionate conversations, and even visited a few times, playing the role of a loving husband. This was all part of his act. He knew that by creating the image of a supportive spouse, he would leave no one suspicious of any malicious intent. When Priyanka returned home in early August, Satish had a surprise waiting. Aiming to strengthen her trust, he blindfolded her and led her into the living room. There, he removed the blindfold to reveal a large photograph capturing one of their happier moments together. The image, seemingly depicting an ideal family life, moved Priyanka deeply, and she felt herself trusting him again. Satish continued giving such gifts over the following days, reinforcing her belief that their relationship had finally reached a place of harmony. By the morning of August 10th, Satish had prepared a new surprise for Priyanka, one with an entirely different intention. He woke her up, hinting that he had something special planned, and suggested blindfolding her to enhance the surprise. Priyanka agreed, suspecting nothing, and Satish gently guided her to a chair, explaining it was all part of their game. When her hands were secured to the armrests, he continued as if everything was going according to plan. This gift would be her last. Eager to see what she thought was another thoughtful gesture, Priyanka even suggested he tie her hands so she wouldn't accidentally ruin the surprise. Smiling, full of trust, she allowed him to use a nylon rope, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She tried guessing what the surprise might be. Perhaps a diamond necklace, she thought out loud. But instead of jewelry, Satish skillfully slipped the rope around her neck and began to tighten it. Priyanka, realizing the horror of the situation, struggled to free herself, but with her wrists firmly bound, she couldn't move. Satish stood silently, watching her, taking in her tightly shut lips and wide, terror-filled eyes. He kept pulling the rope until he was certain she was no longer breathing. But, still unsure, he reached for a pair of gloves he had prepared to avoid leaving any evidence. With chilling composure, he then took a knife and, in a final act, cut her throat to ensure there was no chance she would survive. Knowing he now needed an alibi, Satish took Priyanka's phone and called his own number, making it appear as though she'd tried to reach him. After shutting off both phones, he went out for his usual morning run, where he conveniently encountered a friend, someone he knew could later vouch for his whereabouts if questions arose. He returned home around 6:40 a.m., locked the door from the outside, and calmly walked to his parents' house, about 3 miles away. There, he borrowed his father's car and drove to his workplace, pausing briefly at the entrance to create another layer to his alibi. Leaving the car back at his parents' house, Satish walked home, where the police were already waiting. As the police began scrutinizing his story, the first cracks appeared. On the surface, Satish's account seemed plausible, but as investigators spoke with Priyanka's family, troubling details emerged. Priyanka's relatives revealed that her married life with Satish had been far from happy. They claimed that right after the wedding, Satish and his family had begun to pressure Priyanka, sometimes even harassing her over minor issues. Many times, she had called her parents, crying and seeking comfort, but they had tried to reassure her, urging her to be patient and believing things would eventually improve. 2 years into their marriage, when the situation became unbearable, Priyanka suggested to Satish that they move into a place of their own. In 2010, they began renting an apartment in Holy Mount, hoping the change would ease tensions and help repair their relationship. However, the distance from his family did little to alter their attitude toward her. By the time of the crime, Satish's plan had fully formed, and every detail began falling into place. According to Priyanka's relatives, they believed his family might have been aware of his intentions and perhaps even supported him, though there was no evidence to confirm this. Police grew increasingly focused on Satish, gathering evidence against him, and soon he was taken into custody. His trial lasted several years, with speculation swirling over the motives behind his actions. Finally, on July 28, 2017, Satish was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime against Priyanka and for destroying evidence. He was also fined 225,000 rupees, sparking further public discussion. In prison, with no other path forward, Satish began assisting fellow inmates with their education, which eventually helped some gain qualifications. Years later, he attempted to appeal for a reduced sentence, citing his positive contributions, but the court remained firm. And so, this dark story came to an end, layered with lies, masks, and carefully crafted deception. The truth emerged, leaving behind only emptiness and countless questions. In this case, as in life, sometimes there is far more hidden behind closed doors than we can ever imagine.